this morning. Boy, that sounds loud to me. The Vision Series is a privately funded initiative that seeks to bring programs of cultural and intellectual enrichments to the campus, and today we've got a program that fits that definition very, very well. But I'm not going to introduce the speaker today. I'm going to introduce Dr. Glenn Strocker, who is a professor of geology here at East Georgia College, and let him introduce the speaker.
Thank you, John. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Fredrick Rich, Fred from GSU, Professor of Geology, as today's Vision Series speaker. Fred is a native of Wisconsin, and he has a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Wisconsin. He then went on to the Pennsylvania State University, where he earned a PhD in geology with a minor in botany. His research expertise is palynology, which is the study of fossil plants and fossil plant material and coal petrography. Fred has taught at GSU since 1988, and he served as the departmental chair there from 1988 to 1998. He's taught a number of geology courses, including environmental geology, stratigraphy and sedimentation, historical geology, and also earth science. In addition to numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals and various geoscience awards, he's contributed to 3 movies. One called A State of Harmony, which was produced at Magnolia Springs State Park. He contributed to the television series How the Earth Was Made for the History Channel, and I've seen him in that movie. And he's contributed to Inside Planet Earth for the Discovery Channel and the Science Channel, which I've also seen. The title of his presentation is Wetlands, Peat and Coal, an Ancient Continuum Illustrated by Okefenokee Swamp. And we welcome Dr. Fredrick to East Georgia College.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm going to, excuse me, use the lavalier mic because I like to move around on stage. I've never been able to just stand still while I was lecturing. In any case, I guess this is working, right? Is it working still? Maybe I need to turn on another button. There, that's better. Okay, good. Well, I appreciate your coming here today, and I really appreciate Dr. Strocker's invitation to come over here. He posed this to me late last year, and I wasn't sure that we were going to have the schedule, that I could get my schedule and your schedule to mesh, because I'm pretty busy. Once I stepped down from administration at Southern, I took on a full-time teaching job, which now includes an online class, so I'm effectively at work from 10 until 10 every day. I'm not sure that was a good choice, but that's the one I made. Today I want to talk about something that's been very close to my heart and close to my professional interests for a number of years. As Dr. Strocker said, I grew up in Wisconsin, and I first remember hearing about the Okefenokee Swamp when a good friend of mine, Tony Penn, who incidentally was a direct descendant of Anthony Penn, stopped in the Okefenokee Swamp on a family spring trip to Florida, and he came back, and this was in 4th grade, and he came back and he was telling us about this place called the Okefenokee Swamp, which I'd never heard of, and certainly had never visited, but I was sort of intrigued by the funny name, and it didn't become a part of my objectives, let's say, my life story, until I went to Southern Illinois University. I spent 1 year in graduate school in Carbondale, Illinois, where I met a fellow named Art Cohen, who at that time was one of the preeminent researchers in peatlands and their relationship to coal farming environments. And Art was working in this place called the Okefenokee Swamp. And I remembered that one of the best pieces of advice I got before I left Wisconsin to go on to grad school, and this was from an old friend who said, it doesn't matter what you do when you're in grad school, as long as you enjoy it. Be sure you pick something that you like, because you're going to be doing it for a long time and you don't want to hate it. And I had grown up in a family that had a fondness for wetlands. The only property my parents ever owned was 40 acres of marsh in southwestern Wisconsin. And so working in a wetland was sort of a natural continuation of something that I developed a fancy for since I was a little kid. So when Art Cohen invited me to spend the summer of 1974 in the Okefenokee Swamp just to see if it's something I'd like to work on, I went down there, and I've been back every year since then. Even the 10 years I was at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, which of course is nowhere near the Okefenokee Swamp, I still went back on field trips and for things of that nature whenever I could. So what I've tried to do is put together a talk today that relates the Okefenokee Swamp and the environments of peat deposition there to something that Dr. Straka and I have an equally deep interest in, and that is coals, the nature of coal beds. Well, in his case, he's interested in why they burn spontaneously. In my case, I'm just interested in how they accumulate and what they can tell us about past environments. So the Okefenokee Swamp is one end of what we like to advance as a continuum of sediments that develop first from live plants through the peat deposit that accumulates as pieces and parts fall to the ground, and then following burial and the appropriate amount of aging, let's say in geological change, chemical and physical change, these things eventually can become coals. Not every peat deposit becomes coal, but every coal deposit that exists at one time was peat. So studying that continuum is something that I undertook first at Southern Illinois, just during that 1 year, and then I continued with it for the 4 years that I was at Penn State. Okay, so this is the place we're talking about. I'm always surprised how many people who have grown up in Georgia have not been to the swamp, but it's a place I go to every year. We'll be going there in June with a bunch of teachers. It lies actually across the state line in Florida and Georgia. This part down here is actually known as Pinhook Swamp, and it communicates with the Osceola National Forest in Florida. And the combined Osceola Wilderness, Pinhook, Okefenokee Swamp wetland continuum is vast and largely trackless, and for that reason it's one of the few places in the eastern United States where Florida panthers still live in a more or less unmolested condition. There are two rivers, excuse me, there are two rivers that exit the swamp. The chief drainage out of the swamp is the Suwannee River, made famous by Stephen F. Foster. The Suwannee discharges into the Gulf of Mexico, and the St. Mary's River, this peculiar river with rectilinear drainage, exits at St. Mary's, Georgia, into the Atlantic Ocean. So we've got about 600 square miles that are included in the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness Area, and the waters from that 600 square miles exit the basin through those rivers. The basin occupies its own physiographic province. Oops, this thing's touchy. Come on, there we are. Here's a physiographic provinces map for Georgia. Physiographic provinces are merely those areas that have some sort of internal structure to them, topography, geologic underpinnings, and so on, that make them unique. And the Okefenokee occupies what's known as the Okefenokee Basin. And a structural geologist might look at this and would look at literally the structure of the subsurface and could find that there is actually a basin there. It's not just called an Okefenokee Basin, but it really is a deep area. It goes down to 180 meters depth in that part of southeast Georgia. That is to say, you go down to 180 meters depth and you find that the sediments that fill in this bullseye-shaped hole are all relatively young. And they get progressively shallower, of course, as you go away from the basin. So the Okefenokee Swamp lies within a basin that's controlled by the conformation of the crust of the earth itself. Very little has been done with that, and it would require some pretty sophisticated geophysical analysis to determine just why that embayment is there, but it is. Okay, so additional to the basin, the swamp lies behind an old beach ridge. This oblique view of the Georgia coastal plain, the outer Georgia coastal plain, shows a whole series of parallel ridges that are composed of sand. These are strings of sand that go from the Florida state line all the way up to the Savannah River. And the most inland of these, the highest one, is what's known as Trail Ridge, or the Wicomico shoreline. It's believed to have been a spit, probably not too unlike Cape Hatteras at the time that it accumulated, when sea level was much higher and when the surface of Georgia was structurally lower. This is something else that we still are working on, but I am convinced that Georgia is structurally mobile. It's rising. In any case, this lies at about 150 feet above sea level here, and in this area, its manifestation is not as a sand ridge, but as an erosional scarp or a bluff that lies just this side of the little town of Brooklet, where I live, over in Bullock County. You go up a rise, it's like a loading ramp that goes up to a higher level of landscape. That's what we call the Orangeburg Escarpment, way up in the north end, but down here south of the Altamaha River, it's a sand ridge, Trail Ridge. So the Trail Ridge prograded or migrated as a spit, sort of like Cape Hatteras, moving southward. We think about 2 million years ago, when sea level was higher and when Georgia's surface was lower, and the spit migrated across what would have been probably the mouth of that basin. So we had to have a swamp. We've got a basin that's filled with fresh water. We've got the sand dam that impounds the water. And it wasn't until the Suwannee River and the St. Mary's River were able to cut trenches that drained the swamp that the swamp actually began to drain. There is no single large stream that enters the swamp. In fact, it's estimated that something like 85 or 90% of the water in the swamp originates from precipitation. So it rains heavily, the swamp fills up, it spills out through these two rivers, and there's a dynamic balance between how much water comes in via rain and how much drains out through the rivers. The last few years have been very dry, and so the swamp water level has actually fallen below, well, almost below the point where the rivers even have access to the swamp water itself. So the rivers are running low. All right, so about 2 million years ago, this basin started to accumulate sediment in the form of peat. Not all of the peat has been preserved. Here's another view of this landscape. So we don't have 2 million years worth of peat. In fact, we only have about 8,000 years worth of peat in the Okefenokee Basin. So what happened between 8,000 years ago and 2 million years ago is a real deep mystery. And what we need to do, of course, is just keep poking holes in the ground to find out, but we haven't done that yet. Okay, so here's Trail Ridge. Down here near Stark, Florida, DuPont has a sand mine where they extract what are called black sands. The black sands from Trail Ridge are used to produce white pigment, titanium dioxide. Trail Ridge proceeds north like this up to this Altamaha River, and then it's an erosional surface. So up there between Statesboro and the Ogeechee River, that's where I live, in the little town of Brooklet, and we have that erosional surface there just outside of Brooklet. Okay, if we look at the ages of the basal peats, this is what we get. This is actually this is a poster. This was a big, like 4.5 by 8 piece of poster that we used when we ran a field trip for the Geological Society of America. They had their annual meeting in Miami Beach in 1973, and I was one of the slaves that painted these posters and then hauled them out into the swamp. We were miles out into the swamp with easels and these big posters to show people these various bits of information about the swamp. The posters are long gone, but I did get a picture of one. In any case, here's basal peat age right up here near this marshland here, 6,600 years before present, 4,600 years before present. The oldest peats are, as I said earlier, only about 7,000 years old, so you got to wonder what happened between 2 million and 7,000 years ago. We don't know. It's all still buried in the basin below the deepest peats. And the deepest peats are only about 14 feet deep. It may be 600 square miles of swamp, but it only has 14 feet of peat in it at the deepest. Okay. As far as land ownership, this is a bit of an old map. But it is the map that was used by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of it is the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, as I said. And the interior portions of it are the Okefenokee National Wilderness Area. So this means that it enjoys the highest level of protection that any landscape can have under the aegis of the United States government. This is the one wilderness area, though, where outboard motors are allowed, because when they changed the status of land use from wildlife refuge to wilderness area, they couldn't very well keep all those fishermen that had been going there all their lives out of the deep recesses of the swamp just because they had a little 5-horse motor. So you can motor back into the wilderness. There are some private inholdings in the swamp, but those are gradually being consolidated as the government tries to buy up all the land within the natural boundaries of the drainage basin of the swamp. Okay? The nearest town is Folkestone, which is just to the east, as you can see on this map. It's not a very big town. It's about like Swainsboro, maybe even a little smaller. Okay. Stephen Foster State Park is part of the swamp. I should point that out, not just incidentally. It's not shown on this map, but if you drive from the little tiny town of Fargo here and up into this sand ridge that's known as the Pocket, you go out here onto a little island called Jones Island, and that's Stephen Foster State Park out there. This is the Suwannee River. All of these arcuate features on this map are believed to have been islands at the mouth of a delta back at 2 million years or so ago, when it's believed the Okmulgee River actually discharged into the Okefenokee Basin. So these were sand islands that developed at the mouth of the delta, and the Okmulgee River would have gone up into that drainage there that is now Alligator Creek. All right. As for modern environments, that's sort of a mosaic of environments in the swamp. That's one thing that makes it really interesting from an ecologist perspective. Most of the swamp is covered with swamp forest, and that's largely just cypress forest. So it's something that you're familiar with if you've been to George L. Smith State Park, someplace like that, where you have an abundance of cypress trees growing in what is very still, deep water, black water. The water in the swamp is typical black water. It's full of dissolved organic materials, so the water is about the color of dark tea or even coffee. So this is swamp forest. These are what are locally known as prairies. Here's prairie here. Prairie is actually open marshland. I've got some pictures of that. And then these are longleaf pine forest up on these islands, like the Pocket and Jones Island, Billy's Island, and so on. These are high, dry sand areas that are covered with longleaf pine forest. So there's a nice contrast between uplands and lowlands with deep water or forests. 2 ways to get into the swamp. This is the Suwannee Canal. The Suwannee Canal Recreation Area is the eastern approach to the swamp basin. This is all Fish and Wildlife Service property. The canal was actually excavated in the late 1800s for the purpose of draining the swamp. There was a fellow who he was an officer in the Union Army, I believe, and after the Civil War, he took it upon himself to organize the Suwannee Canal Company, and what they were going to do is go in here and dredge up into the swamp to produce a series of drainage pathways, and then they were going to poke a hole through Trail Ridge and allow all this water in the swamp basin to go into the St. Mary's River, and then they were going to go and harvest all the trees and farm the peat, such as they've done south of Lake Okeechobee in Florida. But the venture failed happily. They went back to the west and dug into the swamp, quite a few miles actually, and then decided, well, let's turn around and head east and breach the Trail Ridge. And as they were digging, and they were using mule-drawn sleds to scoop this sediment out of the ditch and pile it up on the sides. As they went east into Trail Ridge, unbeknownst to them, they ran into what we call a perched water table. So Trail Ridge has its own little shallow water table that's peculiar to the ridge, that's held up by layers of very fine sediment. And instead of the water following them from the swamp out through Trail Ridge, the water was coming out of Trail Ridge into their faces, which was good, because then they went broke and they stopped digging the canal. And it wasn't too long after that the Hebbard Cypress Company and various other interests came in and harvested cypress and eventually local activists petitioned the federal government to have it made into a wildlife refuge. So it's been a wildlife refuge for many, many decades. All right, the other side of the swamp is in some respects the most beautiful. This is where you get calendar pictures. This is the Suwannee River. As you go from Stephen Foster State Park up what's known as Billy's Lake, which is a wide stretch of the river itself, and then you follow the river north along its natural path. This is the Suwannee River right here, but it flows through second and third growth cypress forest that obscures the river to the point where there are places where you wonder where the channel even is, because the river is slipping around among all these cypress trees. You can see that the water's flowing, but there are cypress trees that come almost completely across the channel. Some places the channel's only about 5 feet wide. There's water on either side of the channel back in the trees, but moving water that you can float a canoe in is only a very, very narrow channel. And this is the Suwannee River. Mostly cypress forest. That incidentally burned. A few years ago, there was a massive fire. It went by various names. One of them was the Turnaround Fire, and it burned essentially the entire swamp basin. Now, that's not to say that it killed all the trees or burned all the trees, but it did burn a lot of the brush that underlay the trees. It did destroy some of the cypress forest, which the trees then died, of course. They fell over, and so it's opened up new areas in these otherwise trackless expanses of forest. So the fire is a natural part of the history of the swamp, which I'll get into in a little bit, a few more minutes. Seen from the air, the cypress forest looks like a Persian rug. This is some helicopter work we did back in 1973 and 74, and I don't even remember where this is. It's somewhere up in the north central part of the basin, but that's all cypress trees with tai-tai, which is a common shrub, and a variety of other things that are understory growth. This stuff is so thick, you just don't want to go back there. There was a fellow that got lost. This was a few years ago. His family used to have property back in the swamp on one of the sand ridges, as I recall, and he went back into the swamp in his boat, back in one of the nether reaches of the little boat trails, and then decided he was going to walk from his boat to the island where he thought his family had had this property, and he got lost. And it wasn't that much of a trek. And they ended up sending all kinds of people out there with aircraft to try to find this guy. They found him, and he was alive, but he was scared to death, and he was in pretty bad shape, badly bug bit, among other things. So this is really trackless wilderness. It's good for black bears, and people probably should just stay away from it. Okay, this is the environment that I spend most of my time working on. These are what are called prairies. These are the marshlands. So you have open water, which is occupied by whitewater lilies, and then there are large stands of cypress trees, loblolly bay, tupelo, things of that nature, and then little islands. That little island there, those over there are called houses. And my job as a grad student at Penn State University was to take cores of the sediment through these houses and then analyze it petrographically, which is to say looking at it under a microscope in the same sense that we would look at slices of rock in igneous petrology, say, and look at the pollen and spore record to try to put together a history of the vegetation that would have occupied the site of one of these houses to determine just how it came about. All right. Huge acreages of forest, as I have said, are composed of cypress, that's the dominant tree, Taxodium disticum, and then black gum, which is also known as tupelo, or the generic name Nyssa, or they might be both found in one place, like this house right here, and with lots of southern red maples. Southern red maples, incidentally, normally bloom around the 20th of January. They're one of the earliest plants to bloom in the winter around here, but they're just now in bloom. It's been such a cold winter that the red maples are a month behind in their flowering. This is the kind of stuff I was studying to try to take pollen signatures or pollen spore signatures and relate that to a paleo environment, environments of deposition, paleoclimate, things of that nature. So I've begun paying attention to when these plants flower back when I was at Penn State, and I'm still keeping track of it. Okay, you go inside one of these houses and it's gloomy. It's very dark, it's very still, and there normally are no bugs. One of the misconceptions concerning swamp areas like this is that you go in there and you get carried off by mosquitoes. But there is a little fish called the mosquito fish, Gambusia, that is unbelievably abundant in waters like this, and the Gambusias eat all the mosquitoes. So as long as you have mosquito fish, you don't have many mosquitoes. So the Gambusias are our ally in a setting like this. This is the inside of one of these houses that I took cores in. What we would do is set up a big aluminum tripod. This thing stood about 10 feet high, and then suspend 3-inch diameter aluminum irrigation tubing from it, within which was a big piston like this attached to a twisted wire cable. We'd fix the cable at the top of the tripod, and then using a portable set of handles, drive the tube down into the peat. And we could go down by flights of 4 feet, maybe 5 feet, and then haul one length out, stick in another length until we would get down to the depth of refusal, which is the sand at the bottom of the swamp basin. And then I would take the tubes of peat back to Penn State, slice them open, and get my samples and do the analyses. It was really a pretty slick operation. The only problem with coring in a place like this is you get this thing all set up and everybody's ready to rock and roll. You give a good heave on that thing, you go down 4 feet and you run into a cypress log that's been there for 500 years. And you dig the whole thing out, move it over, offset it, try again, and hope that you miss the cypress log in the next shot. We spent a lot of time moving the equipment. Okay, the best places to core look like this. I don't remember, I didn't put a name on this. I think this is Grand Prairie, so I'll just leave this shot of Grand Prairie. This is almost in the center of the swamp basin, big houses, loads of water lily. You can go back in here with that coring apparatus and core down to the bottom, to the sand, and you'll have nothing but water lily peat. So water lilies in places like this have been growing there for 4,000 or 5,000 years undisturbed, always water lilies. The reason, probably, that the trees haven't been able to take over, and these little islands here will become big islands. We're able to demonstrate that. They will expand as they nucleate. The reason that water lilies haven't been pushed out altogether is that there are periodic fires. And when a fire comes through this area, it will jump from patch of tree to patch of tree because these fires are so big they create their own windstorms. So the trees get burned and die back, and the water lilies don't care. They're out there in their water. Also, the water lilies we discovered by doing depth probes while we were doing the helicopter work tend to occupy areas that are very deep. So these are old stream drainages probably that are full of water and water lily peat that dates back to the beginning of the swamp. So the water lilies have always been there. You can see some boat trails. This is back in the wilderness area, so these would be occupied by canoes. And you can canoe on these trails without too much difficulty because the water is deep enough, and the wildlife refuge does maintain them to the extent that they can, trying to avoid using mechanical trail maintenance equipment. You go back in there with shovels and hose, and you just harvest water lilies and try to keep them from closing up the track. Okay, there's the keystone species. This is Nymphea odorata. This is the plant that occupies so much of the area in the water lily marshlands. So this is the prairie plant in Okefenokee terms. All right, this is what a prairie looks like during a wet year. 1974, there was abundant rain. This is a boat trail in Chesser Prairie, which is easiest to get to from the Sewanee Canal Recreation Area. This is where people who fish the Okefenokee Swamp catch their fish. And there's abundant bass, brim, red breast, and other freshwater fish like that during normal years. When the water is high, the acidity is going to be on the order of 4.5 or so, and the fish and their eggs are viable under those conditions. But during the 10-year drought that Georgia experienced, and that probably isn't over yet, so it's more than 10 years anyway, during years of deep drought, the water will become so acid, the pH might get down to 3.5 to 3.8. It is so acid that the osmotic pressure exerted on fish eggs dries them out. The eggs are poisoned basically by the acid water. So the bass may be living here, but their numbers drop off during drought years because there's no reproduction, there's no replacement. And it really changes from year to year. It's remarkable how differently the swamp looks from one year to the next. Here's a prairie with houses. This is a grass-dominated prairie, so this looks more like the prairie a person might have in mind. This is near Seagrove Lake. There's a beautiful boardwalk that leaves Chesser Island, which is one of the sand ridges, and goes out to Seagrove Lake, which is a natural lake that was probably burned out. The basin was probably burned out during a particularly vicious period of fires, who knows, hundreds of years ago. Anyway, the boardwalk goes from Chesser Island out to Seagrove Lake, and then there's a viewing tower. It looks like a fire observatory out at the end of the boardwalk. You go up into the top of that thing, and as you can see across most of the swamp basin. It's spectacular. It's called the Owl's Nest or Owl's Roost or something like that. Okay, then we go to the Sand Islands just to try to complete the review of environments of deposition. This is Billy's Island. This is on the west side of the swamp, and it's part of Stephen Foster State Park. Billy's Island was, as I said earlier, we think, an island that lay off of the mouth of one of the constituent channels of the old Ocmulgee Delta. These channels are called distributaries, and one of the distributaries that we have in the Mississippi Delta now, Pasalut, is one of the more well-known distributaries. So in any case, the distributary was carrying sand out of the mouth of the ancient Ocmulgee River and deposited it in an arcuate island that, for those of you that are familiar with Mississippi Delta morphology, would be akin to what we call the Chandeleur Islands that lie, or used to anyhow, lay east of the Delta. Hurricane Katrina took away most of the Chandeleur Islands, but they are the same sort of arcuate sand body that Billy's Island looks like. Because the island is relatively high and consequently very dry, it's what we call edaphically dry. The soil is extremely dry. It supports palmetto and wiregrass and longleaf pine. So you get completely different sort of vegetation in these upland areas. And one of the tasks that I faced as I was looking only at dispersed pollen and spores was trying to determine what came from the wetland forest, what came from the upland forest, what came from the marsh. All of this was part of the information I had to gather in order to put together my paleogeographic puzzle. Okay. Diminutive plant communities live on these islands. The islands are like deserts, and it's such a contrast. You have something very similar around here, actually. If you go to George L. Smith State Park, you have 15 Mile Creek, which is where the dam is, the mill. The mill was built in 1880, and it impounded this large mill pond that's full of cypress and tupelo forest. But immediately to the east of the mill and the mill pond, there is a sand ridge that is functionally a desert. We believe those sand ridges came about as a result of wind-blown dune field accumulation, probably between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago. This is probably much older, but it displays the same sort of physical features. The sand is dry, it's hot, the air is humid, but the soils are edaphically dry. That means there is almost no moisture in the soil. So you go out here and you find jumping prickly pear, you've probably seen them. They're awful little things. They live on any sandy subsurface in this part of Georgia. They have tiny little pads with needles that are about a half an inch long, and they will go right through the sole of your tennis shoe. Those things are nasty, and they live up on this sandy island. So it's a desert functionally. The plants are adapted to desert conditions. And just 100 feet away can be a cypress swamp. It's really remarkable, just like George L. Smith. Okay, here is another plant that the Okefenokee shares with George L. Smith. This is what's called runner oak. One of the mantras in the study of pollen and spores is that we look at these dispersed microscopic particles that we find in sediment, and we determine the identity. So let's say it's oak, quercus, all right? And everybody knows quercus is trees that grow to be, 70, 80 feet tall. They have this massive spreading crown that fills up with catkins in the spring. They'll be doing this in about another 3 weeks. And they shed pollen all over creation. And they have ready access to the entire landscape because they're so tall and they produce so many flowers. Well, everybody knows if you find oak pollen, you have oak forest nearby. unless you go to the Okefenokee Swamp. And the first time I saw these oak trees, I thought, you gotta be kidding. I had never heard of runner oak. This is a full-grown runner oak. Here's a camera lens cover down here for scale. We don't use lens covers much anymore, but it's about that big around. So this is an oak tree that's all of 10 inches tall, and it's full of flowers. These are the flowers up here. And it's producing the same kind of oak pollen that a tree that's 70 feet tall produces, with the same sort of mobility characteristics. This stuff flies easily through the air. Well, my goodness. I see pollen in an ancient fossil record, and I'm thinking oak forest, and this is my oak forest. It's not even high as the grasses that grow in the same environment. So I had to readjust my thinking about what does this stuff really represent. We can have oak forests in the Okefenokee Swamp that are 12 inches tall. So you got to look around. There it is, Quercus pumila, and it grows with wiregrass, Arista districta. Wiregrass is common in this part of Georgia, and it gives rise to things like the name of the Wiregrass Trail, for example, a road that goes down through coastal Georgia. Here's Canal Diggers Trail. This is on the east side of the swamp as well. This is a sand pile that was left by the people who were excavating the Suwannee Canal. They just dug the sand out and dumped it in a heap. So you can get to the heaps very easily, and of course it's filled with this little jumping cactus and aristida and various of these other things that are diagnostic of the desert. All right. So we have these terrific contrasts in the swamp. And that sort of contrast is one of the most common things we have in this part of the state of Georgia, and yet I think it's something that a lot of ecologists even don't really appreciate, is the strong contrasts among these environments and how these things can be right next to each other, cheek by jowl, and they tell you very different things if you look at them as indicators of past environment. Okay, the pocket. This is the Arcuate Island that's found on the western side of the swamp, and the pocket is probably one of the best places to look for these sort of contrasts. Here's an image from another one of those big posters that we put together. Here's the pocket, so-called, I guess, because of this arcuate form that it has. This is a sand ridge. There's Jones Island, and that's Stephen Foster State Park. There's Billy's Lake, which I already talked about, and this is the Suwannee River. This is a very peculiar reach of the Suwannee River. The rivers don't normally look like that, breaking up into channels. It's called an anastomosed stream. Okay, from time to time, the swamp burns. It was believed that there was a 20-year burn cycle. I mentioned the significance of the fires, and I'll show you some cross-sections of cores that we derived from the swamp that show the presence of charcoal in multiple layers in the past. But if you go to the pocket and you go out on Billy's Lake, one of the first things you notice is charred stumps, and it seems like such an anomaly, such an out-of-place thing. Here we are with all this water and all the swamp vegetation and charred stumps. Now, how's that work? Well, as I said, the swamp does dry out on maybe a 20-year cycle. The last really significant period of drought before the event 3 years ago now was in 1954-55. There was a fire called the Mule Tail Fire. Ostensibly, the fire was spread because there was a group of people gathering pine pitch for turpentine distillation over on the west side of the swamp in the pocket or one of those islands. And they had a mule-drawn buckboard which had the big barrels in it that contained the pine rosin, or the pitch. And the fire that they were using either to cook or to distill the turpentine, I don't know why they had a fire out there, but apparently they had a fire out in the field. And the story is that the fire caught into the tail of one of the mules that was pulling this wagon full of barrels of pine pitch, and the mule took off, of course, and wherever the mule ran with his load of pine pitch, he scattered the fire, and the mule ran for miles through the woods, is the story. And so the Mule Tail Fire started in the western side of the swamp and burned much of the swamp. The big turnaround fire of a few years ago started with lightning strike and a shorted transformer, electronic transformer. So that stump at the edge of Billy's Lake dates back to 54-55. Here's another one. These are cypress stumps, so they're akin to fat lighter wood. These things are probably going to be there for thousands of years. Eventually they'll be buried and become part of the deposit. but they do present a nice little perch for other organisms, plants chiefly, to get a hold of. There are a lot of plants that are adapted to living just slightly above the water, where it's just slightly drier, and these stumps make a great perch. So the burn stumps are the birthplace for a lot of little forest growth. If we look at what happens on the east side of the swamp in 1977, Chester Prairie was very dry. So if you remember back on that picture of the boat trail where there was plenty of water back in the water lilies, the contrast is what you see in this image right here, where the water lilies are left to just dry out. They're left above the level of the water. The water gets very hot in the summer. This water is too hot to stand in, at least at the shallowest depths, so the amount of biological activity falls off accordingly. And you have these droughts that come and go. If it's as dry as you see in this picture in 1977, and you happen to have a lightning strike, then you have the perfect setting for a major conflagration, and that's what produces the charcoal layers. Okay, here's one of these burn stumps that has an itea growing out of it. As I said, the stumps provide a nice little island for these new plants to appear, some that's like itea, virginica, that really like to grow on these old stumps. That's their favorite place. And so the ecosystem carries on. Okay, so on a very long-term basis, lowlands become uplands, and the particular, at least that's the theory, unless you have fires, and then the uplands become lowlands. I was looking at these islands, so we'll take a little closer look at what I was doing with the islands, and then how that relates to the development of coal bodies. How the islands come to be was first speculated upon by a guy named Eugene Seipert. He worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service back in the 50s, and just by looking at field relationships among little islands, big islands, grass-covered islands, tree-covered islands, it was his contention that these islands, like this big house right here, for example, that has mature cypress trees on it, and these babies could be 70, 80 feet tall without any difficulty. These start actually as floating beds of peat. And the floating beds of peat, I think they're coming up next. There's a little island. This would be covered with wax myrtle, perhaps, or another shrub called tai-tai that is common in these swamps. It only gets about 8 feet tall. According to Seipert's theory, the layers of peat would break loose, and they do this. They detach, I think, along these beds of charcoal. When it's hot and dry, and the peat is exposed to not the drying effects of the sun, but to the heating effects of the sun, you get a lot of microbial activity down in that peat deposit. And this stuff is nasty. You step on it and bubbles of methane and CO2 come pouring out of it. There's enough methane in this gas that you can burn it off if you catch it in a jug. In any case, this floating mass of peat then rises to the surface because there is so much gas trapped within the peat. It detaches along a weak zone. This thing bobs up to the surface, and it becomes what's called a battery. So here's a battery. The water lilies are very unhappy, but seeds of plants like cypress trees that have lain dormant beneath the surface of the water for perhaps years are exposed to the surface. That's all they need to germinate. And so you start seeing little shrubs and trees appearing within a year on these batteries. And it was Gene Seipert's contention that if you just leave this battery alone, eventually it's going to be covered over with shrubs. So the once dominant water lilies just wither and new things take over. So we have lowland becoming upland, and it happens in a matter of weeks or months. And if the little island stays emergent long enough, it could become one of these tree-covered houses. Okay? So there's just a statement about the seeds that lie dormant eventually are able to grow and produce arboreal vegetation, which is what's depicted on another one of these field trip posters. This is really a bad cartoon, but it gets the point across. You start with a floating mass of peat, you get grasses and things. Among the first plants to produce notable growth at this stage in the development of a house is orchids. There are more species of orchids in the Okefenokee Swamp than any place I know of that I've ever visited. And they're all annuals. They grow like mad, they're beautiful, and they live in that situation for a few years, and then shrubs and other things start to appear. They outcompete the orchids, and the orchids vanish. Well, they just take up residence in some other spot. And eventually, theoretically, you get trees. From the coal stratigraphy point of view, this could explain some of the banding that we see in ancient coal beds. And coal beds are almost always uniformly banded. And it's always, well, for a long time it was sort of a mystery. Why do we have these bands of bright and dark coal? And what's this charcoal that's in the coal? Why do we have layers of charcoal in the coal? Well, if you look at the dynamism in an environment like the Okefenokee Swamp, the layers of charcoal that you find either in the peat or in the coal, and the changes in the composition of the sediment make perfect sense. It had to be that way. That's just the way nature is working. So we took cores through these islands, and here's one, Tree Island 3, that I remember very clearly. It was the first one that I completed analysis of. If we look at the bottom of Tree Island number 3, we go back to 5,700 years or so. Down here is sand, and there's a layer of charcoal, okay? There's charcoal all over that basin at the very bottom. Charcoal and cattail pollen and the remains of freshwater sponges and a few other really peculiar things that we don't normally encounter out there, but they're down here. And then water lily peat and charcoal. Water lily peat and charcoal. It's a repeating theme that goes over and over and over again until you get up to the top. And this is where the battery formed. Now, unfortunately, we missed a little bit of the sediment between 48 and 60 inches depth, but above that depth, and the reason this was probably, or the probable reason that this was lost is because this is where the battery formed. So there was a discontinuity in the sediment, and it just wasn't captured in the core. But above that, you have shrub peat. Well, here's Seipert's house laid out nicely. Yeah. Charcoal is burned wood material or plant material like this, so it's actually been burned. Coal has been geochemically aged. There's a process that geologists use called diagenesis that stands for a lot of things, but diagenesis is the slow but inevitable chemical change that's brought about either by organisms, so microbes can cause diagenetic change, or it just happens because there are chemically active constituents in the peat and they react with one another, the atmosphere, rainwater, and this organic matrix changes. Now, in the case of a peat deposit like this, what you get is brown peat, the familiar color of brown that you would see. It's going to have about 85% moisture in it. It's going to have an abundance of what we call humic and tannic acids. Humic acids especially, that's what makes black water black. It's what makes your coffee dark. It's what makes tea tea-colored. And all of that is part of the chemical change that occurs within the peat deposit. But if you bury it for a long enough time, and long enough time, I'm talking, well, 2 million years, you can get a material called brown coal that is more well consolidated. It might have only 75% water, still a lot of water, and it's still brown, but it's consolidated. It's hard. Well, not hard, but it's dense, let's say. If you bury that for even longer period of time, you get deposits such as they mine in Victoria in Australia or in the Rhine Basin in Germany that are dark brown, and they start to look like coal. Now, these have really been aged. They've been buried deeply, so there's been a lot of dead weight brought to bear on them. And these chemical processes have occurred that have changed the stuff from light brown to medium brown to dark brown to black. And all of that is going on around the layers of charcoal. The layers of charcoal start out being black. They're never anything but carbon. They start out being carbon, they stay carbon. But these other things go from being cellulose to being, oh Lord, there's no name for all the organic compounds that are found in coals. In fact, we haven't even identified most of those compounds because there's so many and diverse. But one thing that they share, as they get older, they get darker. Okay. Here's a history of Tree Island number 3. So we look at the thin slices of peat petrography, that tells us a story. We look at the distribution of pollen and plant spores and things as time goes by, and we get the same story. We have an open marsh, we have a house, and we see a gradation between these environments. So it's very dynamic. All right, so houses can form and serve as a nucleus for much more extensive swamp forest. You get other bits of peat docking against the sides of houses, and the forest has the potential to get even more and more extensive. Over the long term, we would expect to see the water lily marsh turn into a swamp forest. but the fires come in and turn the clock back. So it's a pretty neat situation. Okay, here's a cypress stand I took a picture of just last year. This is what used to be a cypress forest, but now it's just a standing grove of burnt cypress stems because of the big turnaround fire of 2009. All right. Again, just reflecting back on the abundance of charcoal. Charcoal is extremely important in determining what the history of these deposits has been. Okay. Let me move on to, this is the material that I have presented in the chapter in one of these coal fire atlas volumes that Dr. Stracker's working on. What I was trying to do was convey visually what the difference is between peat and coal if you look at it under a microscope. So this is peat. This is a thin slice of peat derived from a grass called Panicum hematomon. And what it shows us is organ fragments, bits of stem, bits of root, all this interstitial stuff. This is what peat looks like if you can slice it thinly so that it's translucent and then look at it under a microscope. This is the coal petrographer's view of the world of peat. We look at the little pieces and parts and try to determine what it is they were and what they become. This is obviously something different. This is a twig of a cypress tree that grew out in one of these marshlands. There's the center of the twig. That would be woody tissue. Here's a needle. There's another needle up there. The big hole would have been a resin duct. So we have the plant's anatomy laid out for us very nicely if we're lucky. And so we can use the combination of the pollen and the tissue analysis to determine what the origin of the peat is. If you take that peat and you bury it, and this is what I was getting at before, it changes. This is a thin section of a brown coal from beneath Trail Ridge, actually. This came from not too far from the Okefenokee Swamp, but underneath that 2-million-year-old sand ridge. And doggone if there isn't a cypress twig right there with its appending needles. But it's a different color. It has a different sort of morphology than the cypress twig from Chesser Prairie. This is the result of aging. So this is a 2-million-year-old analog to that cypress twig that was found in Chesser Prairie. If we bury this even more deeply and age it even more extensively, then we get something that might look like this. This is a thin section of a coal from North Lyme, Ohio. So this is 225 million years old. All of these bright yellow things are spores. This red stuff in here is what used to be plant stems. So the chemistry has changed, the physical morphology of these things has changed as a result of the passage of 200 million years, but also as a result of burial. So the peat becomes brown coal, the brown coal becomes coal. And it's a continuum that extends over millions of years potentially. And looking at what we can characterize as say, chapters in the book along the way is what gives us an idea how coal becomes coal. So here's a list of some references, just because that's the proper thing to put at the end of a talk, and pictures of a few alligators. You got to have alligator pictures. Alligators in the Okefenokee Swamp are not a problem unless you're a fisherman and you put your fish over the side on a stringer. You're never going to get them home. The closest encounter I ever had with an alligator down there was over on Billy's Lake. I had gotten some gasoline on my hand. I was sitting in the stern of my John boat, and I just leaned over the stern and did like this in the water, and I heard this little whoosh noise. And I looked up, and not 6 feet away from me was one of the biggest alligator faces I've ever seen. I was so close I could watch a dragonfly land on its nose and sit there and clean its eyes on the alligator face. That was enough to make me be more careful about how I washed my hands. But they are all over the place, but they're not a problem. They're just an ever-present companion. And so, with that, I thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Talk a little bit about, are there problems with invasive species, plant, animal species, and so on?
Invasive species, oh, yeah. I don't know of any serious invasive species problems down there, though the Fish and Wildlife people would probably contradict me. But things like European foxtail or milfoil, which is common in all the freshwater ponds in this part of the country, milfoil is in the swamp. And milfoil can really fill up the water column in a standing water situation. I don't remember having ever seen tallow tree down there, a Chinese tallow tree. That's a real common invasive in wetlands in this part of Georgia. But I think one thing the swamp has going for it is the frequency of fires. And because it's a federal wildlife refuge and a wilderness area especially, if there is a fire, they must let it burn until it reaches the edge of the federal ownership or threatens a building. Then they must try to put it out. Otherwise, everybody's fair game. Yeah. Yeah, in the Everglades. The Everglades is a nightmare of invasive species. No, the Okefenokee has got plenty of its own snakes, its own species, but I've not noticed that they're a particular problem, and I don't know of any invasive ones. I don't think boas would be able to survive a cold Georgia winter. Yeah. There are plenty of moccasins down there, though. Okay, any other questions? Thank you. Right, well, thank you.